Hi, I'm Andrew Walsh, a librarian and researcher of Dayton history. My book, Lost Dayton, was published in 2018 by the History Press, and I had several presentations scheduled for this spring, but due to the shutdown, they've all been canceled. So I wanted to record a presentation online and share it through my website, Dayton Vistas. I'm just going to discuss a few sites from my book, which range from individual buildings to entire neighborhoods, along with plenty of old images and maps to help tell the story. Here you can see an aerial of downtown Dayton looking southeast as it looked in the early 1900s. Aside from just a few structures, practically this entire area has been completely transformed. And the building in the center, which is also on my book's cover, is Steele High School, which had the look of a castle and is considered by many to be one of the greatest buildings from Dayton's past. One common theme in my book is the Great Flood of 1913, which damaged most of downtown and the surrounding areas. Steel was badly damaged during that flood, which started it on a decline that resulted in its demolition in 1955. And today, the first CareSource building stands on the same location. Another iconic lost building is this French Gothic Romanesque public library, which was built in 1888. Before it was constructed, Dayton was actually the first city in Ohio to incorporate a public library, which it did in its first year of existence, 1805. That first location was far from what we'd consider a library today, though, as it was described as two well-filled bookcases in the cabin of pioneer settler Benjamin Van Cleve. This beautiful structure in Cooper Park downtown was its first dedicated home. This was in Cooper Park, like today's downtown library, but not as many pictures show its actual location, as you can see here. You can also see Delco's second factory, the current Mendelssohn building, in the background. Like Steele, the library was hit hard by the flood. This is an image of the west side of the building showing destruction of books, which had to be shoveled out of the building. Here's the scene on the first floor reference room. In all, there were some 46,000 volumes that were lost to flood. Now, the library did recover, but this beautiful building would eventually meet its end. In 1962, a new main library was built next door, and the original structure was demolished. In Lost Dayton, I also use particular sites as vehicles to explore larger themes like losses of industry and even entire neighborhoods that have vanished. So one thing I noticed throughout my research was that downtown and certain areas of Dayton have been covered extensively, while others haven't gotten nearly as much attention. And one particular area that fascinated me is West 5th Street, which is adjacent to today's Wright Dunbar residential area. In my book, I cover two theaters that once stood on 5th, the Classic and the Palace Theater. So the Classic was built back in 1926, founded by Carl Anderson and Goodrich Giles, and it was said to be the first theater in the US to be built, owned, and operated solely by African Americans. The Palace was larger and built in 1927. This was at a time when Blacks were being denied admission to the downtown theaters. And this stretch of 5th in the next couple of decades grew into Dayton's main Black entertainment district. Major stars like Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and Count Basie played here. By 1963, there were some 63 different businesses just on this part of West 5th Street. In addition to the theaters, there were clubs, corner stores, churches that were attended by residents and business owners, and this all helped provide a real community feel. There aren't many surviving pictures of this area, however, none that I've seen that really show the streetscape. So another thing we can do to get a sense of some of these lost areas in Dayton is to look at a particular set of maps that give incredible detail. This is one of my favorite research tools, the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps. Their original purpose was to allow fire insurance companies to assess their liability. But since they contain detailed information about buildings, they've become an amazing resource for tracking changes to cities over the years. The maps have a detailed legend, including what the buildings were made of, how many stories they were, the type of windows they had, and so on. So to take this same corner with the Palace Theater and that corner building, we can look at the same corner here towards the center, which is 5th and Williams. So as you can see in these Sanborn maps, all these little shapes are buildings. And if we use that legend, we could see more about them. And if we use tools like old city directories, we can start to trace what these different addresses actually were. Many were houses, others were shops, and many different things. If we fast forward today, however, just about the entire 5th Street has vanished. And interestingly, this was not a planned urban renewal like other examples in Dayton, like, say, the Haymarket neighborhood, which I cover in my book's first chapter and in my in-person presentations. Instead, West 5th Street suffered a devastating combination of challenges and a slow, gradual demise. In 1966, Lester Mitchell, a black man, was shot and killed on 5th in a drive-by shooting, and the shooter was never found. This turned out to be a tipping point for already alienated black residents, led to the Dayton riots, during which some buildings burned down. Also, freeway construction tore through this area, and 75 completely separated it from downtown. You can see here the same corner of 5th and Williams where the Palace Theater once stood is circled. And you can see the icon where 5th Street just dead ends and no longer has a direct connection to downtown. Other social trends had a large effect on the decline of this street. In 1960, 95% of Dayton's black population lived in West Dayton, largely due to tools of discrimination like redlining and restrictive racial housing covenants. As the most overt of these restrictions started to ease and blacks were more able to move to some other neighborhoods, this type of concentrated community saw increased vacancy. And over the next few decades, more of 5th Street's structures continued to fall in what we'd call demolition by neglect. All of Dayton's inner city neighborhood business districts have hit hard times during these decades of suburban flight. So we see cases of vacant structures and some demolition just about everywhere. But this is truly on another level. There's really no trace of the old West 5th Street. And there were preservation efforts to save these theaters. They were listed on the National Register of Historic Places. There were some redevelopment proposals to turn them into entertainment centers and things like that, but they both eventually fell. The Classic in the early 90s and the Palace in 2002. The Classic Theater's demolition was preceded by an unusual ceremony, a public funeral that included a eulogy. 40 people came and many gave speeches reflecting on what the street had meant to them in the past. But in the end, there didn't prove to be a way to save it. To me, however, Lost Dayton isn't just about demolished buildings and vanished heritage. I also use the word lost to mean sites that have been transformed from their original uses. And I hope my research can help people find some of these remaining parts of Dayton and help bring attention to what remains, and in many cases is on a path to hopeful new life. So one site that I cover in the book is the most highly anticipated redevelopment project in Dayton history, and that's the Arcade, pictured here. Once the crown jewel of the Gem City, it's a 9-building complex with the earliest dating back to 1904, with beautiful architecture, business and apartment spaces, and a stunning central rotunda that originally housed a 200-stall market house. The other iconic arcade image is the Flemish-style 3rd Street facade, here in the upper left, that was patterned after a guild hall in Amsterdam. I chronicle the arcade's up and down history as well as its eventual decline in my book. It's been vacant since the early 90s. When redevelopment was still merely a dream a couple of years ago, I got to tour it on a couple occasions, and it was an experience that filled me with emotion as you could see the beauty and the potential, but at the same time see how much work the project was going to be. And now to see construction crews turning it into a true catalyst for our community is an incredible sight. To continue on this kind of more positive, found Dayton kind of thing, we can now return to that theme of libraries in Dayton. Although we lost the beautiful central branch we saw earlier, the system has held on to some of its other historic buildings. The oldest library branch still in operation today is the Electra C. Doren branch on Troy Street, which dates back to 1928. Electra C. Doren was a suffragist and library pioneer who started the first book wagon service in the US, which brought books out to rural areas of the community. The E.C. Doren Library isn't actually the oldest former branch, however. Back in 1911, Dayton was awarded funds for 2 Carnegie libraries. One was put on the east side and the other on the west side. The east side one still stands and is today used by a development corporation, while the one on the west side burned in 1979 and was torn down. But another structure used by the library, which survives and dates back to the early days of the Miami and Erie Canal, which is today Patterson Boulevard, is today's Library Operations Center, which you can see in this image. It was the former Saxe Pruden Ale Company brewery, the structure built in 1888, which is interestingly the very same year as the old downtown Central branch. More recently, it was the location of Hauer Music. You can see the building still stands today. Overall, I think the Arcade's Sleeping Giant mural on the 3rd Street entrance is a good way to think of Dayton as a whole right now. Despite everything we've lost over the decades, there are a lot of awesome creative projects in the works, and we still have a lot of great buildings with so much potential that are lying dormant and waiting for their rebirth. And I'm looking forward to being a part of it. If you're interested in following my work, you can find my book on my website, DaytonVistas.com, where I also write articles about Dayton history and urban development. Best way to stay up to date is through my newsletter, which you can find at DaytonVistas.com/newsletter. You can also connect on social media. Finally, I've met some great people through my public events, and I'm happy to share individuals' photos of Dayton and tell any interesting stories. The images of the Classic and Palace Theaters were actually contributed by Dan Arnold, who took them in the 1980s for a college project, but never shared them beyond that. Finally, I enjoyed putting together this virtual talk, so if you liked it, please leave a comment and subscribe. I'll definitely do more if there's interest. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.